All right, let's talk about the somatic afferent pathway. So my goal here is to explain how it is that when the person pictured here touches something out here, this is the thing they're going to touch, with their fingertip, that signal gets to the brain and they have the perception of having touched it. So that's going to start with a somatosensory neuron whose dendrites are here in the fingertip. So if we were to draw a kind of a close-up of that, so here's that finger, we would have something that has dendrites out here, which are then feeding into an axon. Now, one interesting thing you'll note here is that this does not follow the pattern of a typical neuron that we talked about. When we showed our multipolar neuron, that had dendrites going onto a cell body, which then went to the axon. Here we've got dendrites feeding directly onto an axon. There's no reason that can't work. Effectively, what happens is that if we create a large enough graded potential in these dendrites, there's a sort of an axon hillock-like thing here, which will then trigger the action potential, which will propagate down this axon. So this neuron is now going to head up here to the spinal cord. And just outside the spinal cord is where we actually find its cell body. Now, remember, what do we call a cluster of nerve cell bodies outside the central nervous system? And this is outside. This is the spinal cord. So this is not in the spinal cord yet. We call that a ganglion. These cell bodies of these neurons are here in what we call the dorsal root ganglion. This is where we find the cell bodies of pretty much all of these somatosensory neurons, what we call primary ones. We'll get to that in a second. Now, that cell body, we actually sort of bypass it. This axon passes up here and just bypasses the cell body and then continues here into the spinal cord. Now, here in the spinal cord, we need to take a moment to sketch this out. We've got gray matter arranged kind of like this. So here's that central canal of the spinal cord. That's a terrible drawing, but it'll do for now. Now, that neuron, where it goes is going to depend a little bit on exactly what kind of information it carries. This one presumably is carrying what amounts to fine-scale touch information. And that kind of neuron carrying that touch information actually goes directly into these things here, which are called the posterior or dorsal columns. And from there it heads up toward the brain. So we would then see this coming up until it gets to the medulla. So let's just indicate where the medulla is here. That's the medulla oblongata. So the neurons that are coming up here go to the medulla, and here in the medulla is where they actually have their first synapse. So what I've drawn there is this neuron, which we call the primary somatosensory neuron. Comes from the periphery all the way past through the dorsal root ganglion into the spinal cord, and then that same neuron is now heading up in the white matter tracts here, and it synapses into the medulla. Here's its axon terminal, and it's synapsing onto a secondary somatosensory neuron. We'll do that in purple, actually, to help keep it clear. So our secondary somatosensory neuron sends its axon across the midline and then up into the thalamus. And in the thalamus, a tertiary neuron sends its axon out here to the cortex, which is where we get the processing and the conscious perception of touch. So here we have our secondary somatosensory neuron. In purple. And in blue, we have our tertiary somatosensory neuron. So the pathway here was primary neuron started out in the periphery. Axon came all the way up here. Its cell body is just outside the spinal cord. Axon continues into the spine and then heads up into the medulla, where it synapses onto the secondary somatosensory neuron, which crosses over to the midline, and then up into the thalamus. Let's just go ahead and indicate the thalamus here. Where it synapses onto the tertiary neuron, which heads up to the cortex. So that is one of these somatic afferent pathways, this is the pathway that would carry most of your touch information. There are a couple of variations on this. For example, some of the neurons carrying crude touch or pain follow a slightly different pathway. We can actually, let me just, I'll sketch that one in here for a moment. So the ones carrying crude touch or pain, let's say from here, the primary somatosensory neuron is similar, but what it does is a little different. So it's going to enter our spinal cord. So there's its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. But it's actually going to synapse here in this dorsal horn. Our secondary neuron is going to come over here, head up a few vertebrae, so we'll say up a bit, then cross over to the other side and head up toward the brain here. It is then going to synapse in the thalamus onto a tertiary neuron. Which is then going to head out to the cortex. So a similar pattern, except that rather than the primary neuron synapsing in the medulla, instead it synapses here in the dorsal horn. The secondary neuron goes up a few levels, crosses over, and then goes to the thalamus. In both cases, the third step is from thalamus to cortex. So those are just two different somatic afferent pathways that you might see. Now let's talk about the somatic efferent pathway. So I'm going to go ahead and layer it on top of this diagram. What I've added on here is the muscle shown here that we're going to have to control in order to get the arm to extend if we want to reach out and press our finger against that thing we just touched. So this mark, for example, maybe we were touching an elevator button and now we're going to extend the arm to press that elevator button. So the decision to press that is coming from the brain. So up here in the brain, not actually in the same area of cortex, but in one nearby, we're going to have a motor neuron up here. So this is going to be our upper motor neuron. Remember, this is now a somatic efferent pathway. So that upper motor neuron is going to send its axon down into the medulla, cross over, and head down in the spinal cord. But it's actually heading down in a different area. So this is down in, probably in here. So this is from the brain. Back that up just a bit. There we go. So here we are coming down from the brain, and we're going to enter the ventral horn of the spinal cord. And here in the ventral horn, we are going to synapse onto, we'll do it in kind of this color, a lower motor neuron. So that lower motor neuron is going to send its axon out from the spine and then up here to join and travel alongside that primary somatosensory neuron until it gets here to the muscle, where it's going to control some muscle cells there. So in this efferent pathway, we have two neurons. The upper motor neuron, which started in the brain, traveled down from the brain through the white matter of the spinal cord and synapsed onto a second neuron, the lower motor neuron, down here in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. That lower motor neuron then sends its axon out to the muscle. Now, something I didn't draw in here was a structure that we find outside the spinal cord. That is the actual spinal nerve itself. And that spinal nerve actually has two roots. This one over here is the ventral root of the spinal nerve. It comes from down here and it carries the axons of lower motor neurons. Up here we have the dorsal root, which contains the dorsal root ganglion. That is carrying axons of primary somatosensory neurons. And those two roots join here into the spinal nerve. So notice that spinal nerve is carrying both afferent sensory axons in green and efferent motor axons in red. So that's why we call it a mixed nerve. So those are the somatic afferent and efferent pathways. The one I want you to pay special attention right now is this somatic efferent pathway. And I want you to notice that from the central nervous system to the target, there is one neuron. Its cell body is here in the central nervous system. Its synapse is here at the target. That's just one neuron that goes from the central nervous system to the target. I want you to keep that in mind because it's going to be a little bit different when we look at the autonomic efferent pathways, which we're going to do. So now you've seen somatic afferent, the body senses, and efferent, controlling skeletal muscle pathways. Those all work pretty much like that. So the next thing you're going to learn about is the autonomic efferent pathways.